Welcome to Redcaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps in the blood of our listeners and ramble on about old school games. Today's episode, we're going to talk to an expert on solo RPGs. As you know, no mortal can outrun a Redcap, so sit back, listen, and I hope you enjoy. Deborah, thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
As I said there in the opening, I consider you kind of an expert on solo RPGs because every time I go to search for anything on it, I come across the Geek Gamers YouTube channel, and I see you sitting there with a crochet hook, pointing at various things and telling us how to do this. Tell me a little bit about your channel and how you got started into doing that.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I'm glad my tagging of videos is working in the search. I started actually not doing so much about RPGs on the channel. I did board games, and I started the channel somewhat accidentally with just wanting to spend time with one of my kids. We did a video of a game we were playing that there didn't seem to be a video on. It was an old Victory Point game, sort of States of Siege thing. And it evolved from there. I did games that I had in my game closet that didn't seem to have many videos on them because I guess I played some obscure games or I had interest in some old Avalon Hill games and some sci-fi war games, things of that nature. And then through that, I did a video, I think maybe it was the fantasy trip that I did first that was kind of dipping into the RPG area because that was a system that I had played around with a lot. And from that, I got into more of doing the RPGs and the solo RPGs in particular, because that's really what I had played. And the first video, or some of the first videos, was the James Bond Assault game. That's from 1986. And that is a game that is meant to be paired with the James Bond 007 RPG. And in the game the game demo that I did that. So I took the board game component and I added the RPG to it. And then from there, it was that was off and running with the solo RPG focus of the channel.
I've seen a lot of folks that play solo RPGs kind of do that mash of taking a game that may not be an RPG game, but is a typical board game would have you, and kind of merge it in with a rule set of an RPG and run a narrative off of that. I'm glad you mentioned Fantasy Trip. One of my favorite games. I think it's fantastic, and it's critically not talked about enough. I do really enjoy, every time I seem to come to your channel, though, you're playing a different game. You have a wide selection of games. Is there one or more that you find work better for playing in solo, or is it kind of almost take any rule set and work it to the narrative that you want to do?
I think for me, I could probably take any rule set and do anything with it, because I'm really focusing on narrative structures and playing with narrative more so than I am the rules. And I have any number of videos on my channel where I demonstrate to start a session not even knowing what rules I'm going to play. And when I make those videos, I actually don't know what rules I'm going to play, but I start to create a story that I know I'm going to play out and flesh out with some kind of rule set. And then based on the story that develops, I'll think for my own repertoire of rule sets that I have or that I know what might be a good fit for that. So I do think you can use anything. I think some are perhaps more in line with soloing than others, or at least in line with soloing for me than others. And those tend to be perhaps ones that would fall maybe more into the light or medium category of rules overhead. But again, that's just my own preference. You could solo something like Traveler. I haven't done that, but I've been thinking about it, where to me, I think, all the rules for absolutely everything, to making a spaceship and every little detail, I think you would be omitting so much, or at least I would be omitting so much by necessity. I'm not sure why I would go to that rule set for a sci-fi feel, but I think you could use any rule set, truly.
I haven't played very many sci-fi games, but I am a big fan of Kevin Crawford and his various books, and he has obviously Stars Without Numbers, kind of his big one. That might be something to look into. He bases them off of BX.
I totally agree. I think that's been on my long list of things to do, and I really I don't have a video on that, and I definitely should. Absolutely. I think his rules in general are quite good for soloing, and he has many different themes that he talks about, and obviously Scarlet Heroes is one that comes to mind because it's explicitly for solo, but he has other ones. Like I did a video on, I think it's called Silent Legions, which is sort of the Cthulhu-esque that works really well solo also.
You mentioned that you played solo RPGs more so than you did traditional DM and player RPGs. Is there a particular reason? Was it a availability of games around you, or a comfort reason, or just wanting to control, a solo narrative rather than a group narrative overall?
Well, I'll say that when I first became aware of Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, I was immediately drawn to it. And when I got to college, there were really no opportunities for me in high school to be aware of at least a D&D group. I'm sure there were some, but I wasn't. As a girl, it wasn't so easy to find out about, let's put it that way, pre-internet growing up. And when I got to college, I went right to the D&D group and probably stayed about 10 minutes because it wasn't super welcoming and I didn't feel very comfortable there. I was the only girl, only young woman there. And I think the guys were not so excited to see me. And, I tend to be somewhat introverted anyway, and I just didn't really pursue it. So I think that was it. It was a little off-putting initially, but why I've kept up with the solo, I think, is just the way I've developed. I like to read a lot, and professionally, I read for a profession and I read for my enjoyment. And I just read a lot of rule sets, and in reading a lot of rule sets, I started to throw together some characters. And as time passed, eventually I would just start to give the character something to do. And then I would try to create a response to that. And that's kind of how it developed organically for me. I think at this point now it's more circumstantial. I have the YouTube channel that I do. I have a family. I have a full-time job. It's more of a convenience. I can get some access to the RPG experience on my own time, as opposed to right now in this stage of my life, I don't have, well, of course, nobody can do this necessarily right now, but say, forgetting the pandemic, I don't really have the opportunity to say once a week for 5 hours or 3 hours, I'm going to spend gaming with friends. It's just not where my life is right now.
Yeah, I think the biggest bane to any sort of a gaming setup is scheduling. I think that's
Yeah.
no matter what the time is, especially in times like now, but even in the before times, scheduling has always been the biggest issue. So if you can play by yourself, you get to set your own schedule, and that probably makes it much easier. I picture, given how much you're saying you're reading, and the amount of different rule sets and characters that you've done up, I just imagine notebooks and notebooks and notebooks all around you that you've filled out. Do you do that when you're playing solo typically? Like, do you keep a record of stuff that you don't record, or is it more you play it out and that was my fun for that time, and you don't keep maybe super meticulous records on each game?
I definitely do not keep super meticulous records. I think I do keep, it's probably more just game by game or session by session or rule set by rule set. And then I don't actually toss it necessarily, but they are all in various notebooks and I might not refer to them. What I do a little bit more systematically is when something arises in a game, when I am playing and there's like an interesting narrative twist or a response from the rule set or something that happens that seems like I could apply that as a general principle or something to talk about, say, on the YouTube channel, I'll keep a kind of separate note about that. Oh, maybe I want to do a video on that. So I did a video a while ago on creating themes in RPG play because I was playing and I'm realizing I do this kind of instinctively, but I realized I could talk about it in a way that might make sense or might be instructional for people who are coming to the channel. So as the channel has grown and as I've become more committed on the channel to teaching about how to do or how I do solo RPGing, I do keep those kind of notes. And I'll say, I think at the beginning you might have said something like I talk about how to do it. I think you could do solo RPGing really in any way that you want. I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way. I do think there are some narrative principles and narrative understandings about how narrative works that if you have them and if you understand what they are, it might make doing a solo RPG session more rewarding. It might make you less in a position where you're kind of rolling the dice to try to just like get an answer that will move you forward, which is kind of, that's just not that fun because or at least not that fun to me, because that's when you kind of fall into needing the structure of a board game. A board game provides you a structure when you roll a dice to get somewhere. And an RPG rule set without the GM really doesn't.
Yeah, I found sometimes when I've been trying to experiment with solo RPGing, I get myself caught up where I'll do a roll and then I'm like, okay, well, I got to go write down what this roll was and why I did the roll and what the roll came, and then it kind of throws me out of the story altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm trying to get myself more into like, no, just don't worry about recording it, just continue telling the story, and then if you want to do a recap afterwards, you can. But I don't know if I don't know if it's from playing as a GM and trying to keep track of everything that I'm having a hard time getting myself out of that headspace. But I find that's usually my biggest problem is not maybe micromanaging it as I go and just letting it flow as per normal.
I think that is pretty common, especially when people come to solo RPGing from tabletop RPGing, and there is maybe even just implicit expectation that you're trying to kind of do the same thing or get the same exact experience or mimic that experience of sitting around with a GM and a bunch of friends. And I don't view it that way. I don't think you can do that. And for me, I'm not trying to do that. I think that the solo RPGing is different. It's really creating a story with the help of RPG rules and conventions and randomizers like dice. And you're both the GM and the player, obviously, but really what you're doing is something more like game storytelling or enjoying, say, playable fiction, something like that, or emergent fiction. You could think of it that way. And I think changing the mindset a little bit about thinking about what you're there to do and therefore what a quote unquote success or quote unquote failure in doing that is kind of opens it up a little bit and makes it more possible to enjoy different things that happen in the session, as opposed to looking for the kind of enjoyment that you might get from a traditional RPG experience.
How do you handle making sure that you don't turn just completely into an author when you're playing? So there's been times where I've rolled a dice and I looked at it and went, no, that's not going to make any sense in this story, and I'm going to go my own way with it and plug in whatever I felt was right. But then there's a fine line where where you can do that to a point, and then you're like, oh, am I still actually playing the game, or am I just writing a story? And I'm wondering
That's a great
how you
question.
balance it.
Yeah, that is a really great question. And I think sometimes it happens where you just, I don't want to say you're stuck, but you do just sort of turn into that, like, well, I don't like that and I don't really like that. And for me, because I'm not really looking to do a whole narrative journaling, and a lot of people do that. And I know that a lot of soloists do that. And that's a very legitimate way of experiencing solo RPGing. It's just not my interest. But when I get too far into that, frankly, I just maybe stop. I say like, well, you know what, this really isn't working out that much. I'm not that engaged in it. You can always try. There's tricks you can try. You can try the trick of like, okay, end scene, and then just like pick up something totally new. You can always go to a random table and do a couple of rolls and just try to see how you could connect something or turn something small into something big. And by that, I mean, have your character, say, find a trinket lying around, and then from that trinket, roll out or develop the history of it or the connection of it or who made it or who left it, anything like that, that might spark something that would give you something new into the scene where you are, so you don't have to keep rolling the dice and just trying to look something up. But that, it definitely happens. And I think, as with anything, sometimes we have gaming experiences that aren't all that. And, maybe that's just one of those times.
What is the most common tool? Because I know you use a ton of different tools, whether it's rule sets or what have you, but what is the most common, either like Oracle or emulator or tool set that you use? And what, on the flip side of that, what would be maybe the most novel or most unique one that you've used as you're kind of going through your various games?
I think I did a video on my channel that was called My Solo RPG Wallet Revealed, because I have this wallet where I have a bunch of Oracle tables, or, well, it's Oracle tables and like a percentile table in there of various times that various ones that people have created. I think for me, the one that I use the most is just a super basic one. It's a D100 table. I don't even know who made it. Anybody could have made it. It's just divides up into like from 1 to, if you roll between a 1 and a 90, it's a sure thing, like a total yes. And then all the way down to if you roll between 1 and 10, it's like impossible. And then it breaks it down. So it's very, very simple. I'm not a big fan of Oracle tables, and I know there are some great emulators out there, like obviously Mythic is very popular. The Fate system is very popular. I tend not to use them because I find in my sessions, if I start relying too much on that, again, if I'm relying too much on a die roll to give me a narrative direction, it means for me that I haven't really built the story up enough. So for me, I don't use a ton of them, but I would say that another one that I really like is it's a D20 table where it's basically all the way from, impossible to definite, total yes to a total no. But within it, it's broken down. So it's like slightly more likely, maybe, possibly. And I feel like that, if I have a feeling, if I'm sort of, I have a feeling, yeah, maybe this thing's going to be magic that I understand. Maybe I feel like I can go to that table and see what the roll would be and then do the rolling. So to the extent that I use things like that, that's what they are. I would say the most surprising one that I use is, and I've done this also on the channel, to go to a novel, nothing related to RPGing, but say some Victorian literature that I might know well, and just do a random roll and get a page from a novel and start reading, and then read until there's something there that makes sense and I can connect to my story in some way, and use that to determine what happens next or who I meet or what I found or something like that. So I'm fond of just going right outside of gaming altogether to get inspiration. I do this also with architecture books, is another favorite of mine, where I will take I have an interest in architecture and design, building design, and I'll just take one of those books and roll a dice within or use a randomizer on the computer to get a page number and just start reading and use that for inspiration.
I really like the idea of that, of taking a novel and then just reading until something on that page kind of clicks. That's an excellent idea.
It's
I'm
it's it's great because it does take you outside, and it also reinforces the concept that, what at least my sense of what solo RPGing is at its heart, is making a progressively revealed story that's going to develop, and it is going to, you're playing that story out using the mechanics of a rule set, but that ultimately what's happened is it's this progressive reveal that you're trying to get at, I think, as the soloist. And that's the kind of grail of soloing, is you want a way to have that emerge from your game mechanics and in a way that makes sense but is also surprising. And I think going outside of the RPG world can really help.
How long are most of your sessions when you play? Is it, or I guess maybe how long are the stories generally? And is it like a one session and you're done with that story, or do you have ones that have been going on for ages and you just pick it up as you have inspiration for it?
I definitely don't have ones that go on for ages, although I will say I have, it's not really an RPG, but there's a pen and paper, a P&P game called Pocket Dungeon, and it's a pretty straightforward sort of dungeon crawl that is, I played many years ago, and I found some old characters that I left in a folder, and I took them out, and I had made little story notes with them, and I picked them back up again, and as if time had passed. But generally speaking, I would say I am doing a couple of sessions until I feel like there's some conclusion. And again, partially that's my own circumstances. I feel a great responsibility to the channel now to be presenting and doing lots of different things. And my sense of what I want to do on the channel is not to just run one long story, as I think is great to do, but it's just not what I'm interested in doing. So there's partially that, because a lot of my playtime is for the channel. And partially it's just my own interest in experiencing as many rule sets as I can. But I will revisit rule sets. So I will play a session that's maybe 2-3 hours over 2 or 3 sessions and I feel done with it. And that doesn't mean I won't play those rules ever again, because I definitely will and I definitely do. Occasionally I'll go back and look at the character and maybe remember that story, and maybe that story then becomes like a minor background story for the new thing that I'm doing. But I'm usually making new characters and making new stories.
And is there one that, if you were to tell somebody, I had this amazing session, like what is your gold standard of the stories that you've put out? Like what is the one that sticks in your head and you're like, yep, that went perfectly, or maybe it went completely wrong, but it's still incredibly memorable, whichever it may be.
Right. Well, almost maybe the latter. I think the one that comes to my mind when I'm asked this question, and the one that seems to stick with a lot of my viewers on the channel, is I did something on the Warhammer Quest role play system, and in that video, all the characters fell into this pit, and like one after the other tried to get the other one out, and they kept kind of falling in, and it became very amusing. And that the sense of humor developing out of a session, I think, is very novel and doesn't always happen. And that makes something memorable to me. I will say also that when I did my Ironsworn videos, I did my Ironsworn videos shortly after I had done a vlog, a series of videos on learning Magic Realm, or attempting to learn Magic Realm. And I used as my characters in Ironsworn some of the character cards from Magic Realm. And I was really happy with the way that turned out. I had, for my sense personally, I had a real strong feeling about the characters and how they were working in the Ironsworn world, and also the connection to the art and the concepts from Magic Realm. Just that really worked well, I thought.
Excellent. Is there anything that you would suggest to folks that have only ever played the traditional, DM with players, and they're locked up? Maybe they don't want to play online. They're locked up at home right now due to the time that we're in, and they're thinking of getting into solo RPGs. What's the most compelling reason? What's the most useful tip they should take away?
Well, I think it's something I said earlier. A couple of things. One would be not to try to emulate the experience that you would be having with your GM, because I think that just leads to disappointment, because it's really not the same thing. It just, at least in my opinion, it's just not. It might feel on some level occasionally similar, but it's ultimately not the same thing. So I think having the right mindset is really important. And I think if you're a board gamer, I would suggest looking to some of your board game components for inspiration to start a session. So I've talked about this also and demonstrated this also in other videos I have. But if you have a favorite, say you're doing something in fantasy, you have a favorite fantasy board game, take out the board game and look at whether it's modular pieces or an actual game board, and imagine that you're creating a character really living in that world, not in the board game, but in that world separate from the board game, maybe as a place to start, because that way some of the narrative lifting has already been done for you, and you can spark your imagination with a board game perhaps, or a world perhaps that you already have some attachment to, that you already like, and that you already feel a connection to. I think that makes it like you're not starting totally from a blank page, because I think what can happen is people will sit down, they'll get all excited about doing it. Maybe they'll make a character, because making a character is the easiest thing to do on your own, because their structure is already there for you. But then they have nothing for their character to do. So my advice is to start really with an environment. Think about a place, figure out a place, and you could figure out that place by looking at a board game. You could figure out that place by rolling on some random tables, or you could just invent the place, or you could roll on a novel and come up with a place. But if you have a place and then you make your character, once you attach your character into a place, you will be able to suggest, and you will have suggested to you things to do.
I think that's excellent advice, even for people who are still playing the traditional DM and player mode. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the world that the DM presents and the characters the players bring, and I think using that same methodology of before everybody gets together, sitting down and deciding some of that stuff is definitely useful there as well, and that's really good advice. Besides the channel, is there anything else that you've been working on?
I've been working on a book. I've been working on a solo GM guide, or I should say I am still working on it. And this is going to be for the soloist some of the ideas, some of the principles, some of the narrative concepts that I talk about on the channel. It is going to be rules neutral. So the purpose of it is really for the soloist looking to understand some of the narrative tricks and tips that I have and things that make sessions work no matter what rule system you're using. So that's a project of mine. And I'm also just thinking about the channel in terms of what's next, what videos I can provide that will be demonstrations of gameplay, that will be demonstrations of narrative understandings or concepts in RPGs. So I'm always thinking about that too. But right now, a lot of energy is going to finishing up this manuscript.
I look forward to seeing that. Is it something that's far away, or is it something you think will be relatively close?
Well, I'm in book publishing in the real world, so I'm going to have to say it's never as close as you want it to be. But most of the writing is done now. I'm just sort of polishing up some things, and it's on the way. We'll put it that way.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for talking to me about this. I think it's something that people should try out more, if for nothing else, just to flex creativity a little bit on their own end. And there is, I know it's not a writing a story. It's just, going through a creative narrative, but there is the National Novel Writing Month. Maybe folks could use this as inspiration for creating a character in a setting and going and getting a little story written outside of solo RPG as well.
Well, that's a great idea. I hadn't really ever made that connection, but it's a great idea. And I think, as I said, I think I know there's a whole area of solo RPGing that I don't really have a lot of knowledge about because it's not the way I play, but that really does involve a heavy writing component where the rule sets are largely writing prompts. And I think that is a wonderful way to experience play. As I said, it's not my preferred way because I really still like rolling the dice and focusing on the different rules that allow for actions to happen differently depending on what rule set you're using. But certainly thinking about it in that way, and if somebody is drawn to it in that way, that's a great way to experience it as well.
Awesome. So, Deborah, everybody can find you on the Geek Gamer website, or sorry, Geek Gamer YouTube channel. Do you have a website as well, or is it just a YouTube channel?
It's just the YouTube channel right now. I don't really have any other social media. It's just Geek Gamers as the YouTube channel, and that's where it can be found. I have an email address there if you want to contact me for a gaming business purpose, but that's the extent of it at the moment.
All right. So I hope everybody goes over and takes a look at the videos. She has a lot of videos there, and they're all fantastic. And I'm sure once more news of the book comes out, she'll be sharing it on there. I'll include a link to the YouTube channel in the description of the podcast. And again, I thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It was a lot of fun. I'm going to try to take some of those tips that you mentioned, especially the one of taking a book. I never thought of that, and I think it's amazing. I'm just looking over my bookshelf now going, yep, there's a bunch of stuff over there I can start pulling down to find out some prompts or what have you to continue a story. But thanks again so much for talking with me. It's great.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed it as well.
Great. So, folks, this wraps up this episode of the Redcaps Podcast. I hope you enjoyed, learned something, and you're eager to come back for more. If you could subscribe in the podcasting app of your choice, it would warm my cold little heart. If you want to find me, you can find me at anchor.fm/theredcaps, or say hi to me on Twitter or Facebook at theredcapsnet. There's the Discord server as well, and that'll be linked down in the description of the podcast. Until next time, remember, never let your caps dry out. Stay safe, have fun. We'll talk again soon. Take care.